Listen, I need to talk to you about something that's keeping me up at night. And if you're over 60 with money in traditional banks, this should terrify you too. There's a banking crisis coming in 2026 that will specifically devastate retirees and seniors. And the warning signs are already here. Most people aren't paying attention because they think their money is safe, protected by FDIC insurance and government guarantees. They're wrong, and I'm going to show you exactly why. If what I'm about to reveal concerns you even slightly, you need to hit that subscribe button right now, because I'll be releasing more critical financial warnings that could save your retirement. Over the next several minutes, I'm going to expose the specific mechanisms banks are using to trap your generation, why traditional safety nets won't protect you this time, and most importantly, the exact steps you must take in the next 90 days before it's too late. Here's what's happening right now that nobody's connecting. Regional banks across America are quietly failing at a rate we haven't seen since 2008, but this time the media isn't covering it aggressively because regulators are orchestrating silent takeovers to prevent panic. In the past 18 months, 7 regional banks have been absorbed by larger institutions in what they're calling mergers, but are actually government-facilitated rescues. First Republic Bank collapsed and was seized by regulators before being sold to JP Chase. Silicon Valley Bank failed overnight, wiping out billions in uninsured deposits. Signature Bank was shut down by regulators in a coordinated Sunday operation. These weren't random failures, they were canaries in the coal mine, and more are coming. The banks that collapsed were following the exact same pattern, and that pattern is now visible in dozens of other institutions that happen to hold the majority of senior retirement accounts and fixed income investments. The fundamental problem is something called duration risk, and it's a ticking time bomb specifically targeting the banks where seniors keep their money. Here's how it works in plain language. When interest rates were near zero for over a decade, banks took your deposits and invested them in long-term government bonds and mortgage-backed securities that paid maybe 1 or 2%. This seemed safe because government bonds are supposed to be the safest investment in the world. But then the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates aggressively to fight inflation, and those old bonds that banks bought became worth significantly less. If a bank holds a bond paying 2%, but new bonds are paying 5%, that old bond is worth perhaps 30 or 40% less if they need to sell it. Banks are now sitting on over $600 billion in unrealized losses on these bond holdings. That's $600 billion of value that's vanished from bank balance sheets, but it doesn't show up as a loss until they're forced to sell those bonds. Why does this specifically hurt seniors more than younger people? Because the banks most exposed to these losses are regional and community banks that traditionally cater to conservative investors, retirees, and people who prefer personal relationships over big Wall Street institutions. These are the banks in your hometown, the ones where you've had accounts for 30 or 40 years, where you know the branch manager by name. They're the institutions that invested most heavily in safe government bonds because their customer base, primarily seniors and retirees, demanded conservative investment strategies. They followed the playbook that was supposed to protect your money, and that's exactly why they're now the most vulnerable. The big banks like JP Chase, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo have much more diversified portfolios and can weather these losses. It's the smaller institutions, the ones holding your retirement money, that are at existential risk. But here's where it gets significantly worse. And this is the part that should genuinely terrify anyone over 60. FDIC insurance, which everyone believes protects their money, has a fatal flaw that almost nobody understands. The FDIC insurance fund contains approximately $125 billion to protect over $10 trillion in deposits across American banks. That's roughly $1 of insurance for every $80 in deposits. The system works perfectly fine when 1 or 2 banks fail per year because the FDIC can easily cover those losses. But when multiple banks fail simultaneously, which is exactly what's building right now, the math becomes impossible. If just 5% of American bank deposits needed to be covered by FDIC insurance due to widespread failures, the insurance fund would be completely exhausted in a matter of weeks. Now, the government will tell you they can simply print more money to cover FDIC obligations. And technically, that's true. Congress can authorize unlimited funds to backstop the FDIC if necessary. But here's what they won't tell you about what happens during that process. When multiple banks fail, and the FDIC needs emergency funding from Congress, there will be a period of days or potentially weeks where your money is frozen while they work out the political and logistical details. During the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, even insured depositors couldn't access their money for several days. Imagine that happening across dozens of banks simultaneously. Even if your deposits are under the $250,000 insurance limit, you could find yourself unable to pay bills, unable to buy groceries, unable to access your own money for an indefinite period while bureaucrats in Washington argue about funding packages. For seniors living on fixed incomes who need regular access to funds for medical expenses, prescriptions, and basic living costs, even a 2-week freeze could be catastrophic. There's another mechanism at work that specifically targets how seniors use banks, and it involves something called bail-in regulations that were quietly implemented after the 2008 financial crisis. Most Americans have never heard of bail-ins, but they represent a fundamental change in how bank failures are handled. In the old system, when banks failed, the government would bail them out using taxpayer money. The new system, implemented internationally through agreements like Basel III, allows banks to convert your deposits into bank stock to recapitalize themselves during a crisis. This is called a bail-in, where depositors bail in the bank rather than the government bailing out the bank. This means that in a crisis scenario, you could wake up one morning to discover that your cash deposits have been converted into shares of a failing bank that might be worthless. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's established regulatory framework that's already been used in Cyprus in 2013 and has been incorporated into banking laws across most developed nations, including the United States through the Dodd-Frank Act. Here's the specific timeline I'm concerned about and why I believe 2026 will be the trigger point for this crisis. The Federal Reserve is caught in an impossible trap. Inflation remains stubbornly above their target, which means they need to keep interest rates elevated. But keeping rates high continues to devalue all those bonds that banks are holding, making their balance sheets progressively weaker. At some point, either inflation forces rates even higher, which triggers immediate bank failures, or the economy weakens enough that loan defaults start rising, which also triggers bank failures. Either scenario leads to the same destination. My analysis of current trends suggests we're approximately 12 to 18 months away from the stress becoming unsustainable, which puts the crisis window squarely in 2026. The commercial real estate market is another domino that's already falling and will accelerate bank failures. With remote work now permanent for millions of Americans, office buildings in major cities are sitting empty with occupancy rates below 60% in many markets. These buildings were financed with massive loans from regional banks, the same community institutions holding senior deposits. When these loans default, and they will default because there's no viable path to profitability for empty office towers, regional banks will face another wave of losses on top of their bond portfolio problems. Commercial real estate loans represent nearly $3 trillion in bank assets, and estimates suggest at least 20% of those loans are currently underwater or will be within the next 2 years. That's $600 billion in potential losses hitting the exact banks that are already weakened by bond portfolio losses. Now, let me be very clear about something, because I don't want to create panic without providing solutions. Your money is not safe in traditional banks using traditional strategies, but there are specific actions you can take right now to protect yourself. The key is understanding that this crisis will unfold in stages and positioning yourself before each stage hits. We're currently in stage 1, where cracks are appearing, but most people remain unaware. Stage 2, which I expect within the next 6 months, will involve more visible bank failures and growing public concern. Stage 3, likely in late 2026, will be the acute crisis phase, where multiple banks fail rapidly and depositors panic. If you wait until stage 3 to act, you'll be competing with millions of other people trying to move their money simultaneously, and you'll likely find yourself frozen out by bank withdrawal limits and regulatory holds. Here are the specific protective measures I'm implementing personally and recommending to anyone over 60 with significant deposits. First, immediately verify that all your bank accounts are under the $250,000 FDIC insurance limit. This includes checking accounts, savings accounts, and certificates of deposit at each institution. If you have more than $250,000 at any single bank, you need to split those funds across multiple institutions immediately. Don't procrastinate on this. The FDIC insurance limit is per depositor, per institution. So 250,000 at Bank A and 250,000 at Bank B are both fully insured. Married couples can double this through joint accounts and separate individual accounts, but you need to verify the specific ownership structures with each bank. Second, diversify away from regional and community banks into the largest systemically important banks that the government absolutely cannot allow to fail. These are institutions like JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo. I know many seniors prefer community banks because of personal relationships and local service, and I respect that sentiment. But in a crisis, the government will protect the institutions they consider too big to fail before they protect community banks. This isn't fair, it isn't right, but it's reality. Moving a portion of your deposits to these mega banks provides an additional layer of protection beyond FDIC insurance because the government has explicitly guaranteed they will not be allowed to collapse. Third, consider moving a portion of your liquid savings out of traditional banks entirely and into Treasury securities that you hold directly through Treasury Direct. This is the government website where you can buy Treasury bills, notes, and bonds without going through a bank. The crucial advantage is that you own these securities directly in your name, not through a bank that could fail. If you hold a 6-month Treasury bill purchased through Treasury Direct, you are a direct creditor of the United States government with no bank intermediary involved. Even if every bank in America failed simultaneously, your Treasury Direct holdings would remain completely safe and accessible. Treasury bills currently pay around 5%, which is competitive with or better than most savings accounts, and the interest is exempt from state taxes. For seniors who need safety and reasonable returns, direct Treasury ownership should be a core component of your strategy. Fourth, maintain at least 3 months of living expenses in physical cash stored securely in your home. I know this sounds extreme, and I know there are risks to keeping cash at home, but consider the alternative. If banks close temporarily or freeze accounts during a crisis, how will you buy food, pay for prescriptions, or handle emergencies? 3 months of expenses in cash provides a crucial buffer that ensures you can survive a short-term banking disruption without depending on anyone else. Store this cash in a fireproof safe, tell a trusted family member where it is, and remember that having physical currency that you can spend immediately is worth the storage risk during a banking crisis. Fifth, convert a portion of your savings into hard assets that hold value independent of the banking system. This doesn't mean you should rush out and buy gold bars, although precious metals can play a role in a diversified strategy. What I'm talking about is owning things that have intrinsic value and can be used or sold regardless of what happens to banks. This includes paying off your mortgage if you still have one, because owning your home free and clear means you can never be foreclosed on regardless of banking problems. It includes prepaying known expenses like property taxes and insurance where possible. It includes investing in home improvements that reduce your monthly costs, like solar panels that eliminate electric bills or energy efficient appliances that cut utility expenses. The goal is to reduce your dependency on having constant access to bank accounts by front-loading expenses and owning assets outright. The biggest mistake I see seniors making is assuming that because the government bailed out banks in 2008, they'll automatically do it again. That assumption ignores the dramatically different political and economic environment we're in now. In 2008, the national debt was $10 trillion. Today, it's $35 trillion and growing. In 2008, interest rates were low, so the government could borrow cheaply to fund bailouts. Today, interest rates are high, making government borrowing expensive. In 2008, there was bipartisan political will to save the financial system. Today, there's deep political division about whether banks deserve to be rescued. The next crisis will unfold in a much more fragile economic and political environment, and you cannot assume the government will or even can mount the same type of rescue operation. There's also a generational wealth transfer component to this crisis that directly affects seniors. Younger generations who are deeply in debt and struggling financially have much less sympathy for retired seniors with accumulated savings than previous generations did. When the crisis hits and politicians debate bailout packages, you can expect significant political resistance to using taxpayer money to protect retiree deposits. There will be arguments that seniors had decades to prepare that they benefited from economic advantages younger generations don't have, and that limited government resources should go to helping young families instead of protecting retirement accounts. I'm not saying these arguments are valid. I'm saying they will be made loudly and will influence political decisions about who gets protected and who doesn't. Let me address the psychological barrier that prevents most seniors from taking action, because I know what many of you are thinking right now. You're thinking that this sounds alarmist, that surely the government and banking regulators won't let things get this bad, that this kind of crisis can't really happen in America. This is called normalcy bias, the human tendency to believe that things will continue working the way they always have. Normalcy bias is why people don't evacuate before hurricanes, why they don't prepare for earthquakes, and why they don't protect their money before banking crises. Every major financial crisis in history was preceded by a period where warning signs were visible, but most people convinced themselves everything would be fine. The people who protected themselves weren't lucky. They were people who overcame normalcy bias and took the warning seriously while there was still time to act. I want to be very direct about something. I'm not selling you anything. I'm not promoting a specific bank or investment product. I don't benefit financially if you follow this advice. I'm sharing this information because I've spent my entire career analyzing complex systems, identifying breaking points, and preparing for scenarios that most people don't see coming. The banking system as currently structured is unsustainable under the stress it's experiencing, and seniors will bear a disproportionate burden when it fails because of where and how you keep your money. This isn't speculation, it's mathematical certainty given current trajectories. The only question is whether you'll be one of the people who prepared in advance or one of the people caught completely off guard. Your generation lived through periods when banks were rock solid and government guarantees meant something. You developed financial habits based on that reality, and those habits served you well for decades. But the world has changed, and the banking system has changed, and strategies that worked for 40 years may not work for the next 40 months. This isn't about abandoning banks entirely or keeping all your money under your mattress. It's about recognizing systemic risk, diversifying your storage of wealth, and having backup plans so that when disruption comes, you're protected while others are panicking. Take action this week. Not next month, not when you get around to it, this week. Call your banks and verify your FDIC insurance coverage. Open accounts at a large systemically important bank if you don't already have one. Go to Treasury Direct and learn how to purchase Treasury securities directly. Calculate 3 months of expenses and begin accumulating that amount in physical cash. Talk to your family about these concerns and make sure someone you trust knows your financial situation and backup plans. These actions require maybe 6 hours of total effort spread across a few days, but they could mean the difference between weathering the coming crisis comfortably and experiencing genuine financial hardship. If this information has opened your eyes to the reality of what's coming, you need to share this video immediately. Send it to your spouse right now. Email it to your retired friends and neighbors. Post it on Facebook where your generation actually communicates. This isn't something to watch and forget. This is information that could save someone's retirement if they act on it. Hit that subscribe button because I'm releasing more detailed financial protection strategies for seniors every single week. Information the mainstream media won't tell you because they're afraid of creating panic. But I'd rather have you prepared and protected than comfortable and broke. The choice is yours, but the window to choose is closing faster than most people realize.